And there's a chair over there, if you want a chair, yeah? Okay, so, yes, so Liz has welcomed you, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what Amazine and I are doing this year with Campaign for Truth and Iron Anti-Semitism. You've all got some stuff on your chair that tells you a little bit about our organization. And you've also got this wonderful card that we designed with Richard's definitions. So the first in the series is called Palestinian Cognitive Warfare, and it's Caliphater Cogwar in Western schools. And what we have done about this, we've in our submission to the Government Select Committee in 2017, we wrote about the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and the board and the BDS. And this is what we said: BDS, together with PSC, is responsible for much of the violence found against Jews on university campuses, so that today many Jews feel threatened at university. In 2007, the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs published a book entitled Academics Against Israel and the Jews, edited by Manfred Fürstenfeld, who's an expert on anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. And so the question is, why would a book published in 2007 be critical in 2020? And the link is this: those self-same academics who are charged with educating our teachers have produced the teachers who are now educating, and in many instances indoctrinating, our school children. And this is the discovery that Amazon and I found last year, that going from universities, they're going into the schools. So why would a book, imagine a School Rivers of the World project, an international art and education project delivered in partnership with the British Council, whose aim is to connect pupils around the world to their local river through environmental, economic, and cultural learning and themes, whilst exploring rivers vis-a-vis pollution, both locally and in other countries. So this is a national project that the schools are asked to deliver to their children. What alarmed us about this particular project is that it is described as non-political in its exploration of these issues in respect of the rivers, both in Dagenham and in Jericho. So the question arises, why Jericho? Why not Alexandria and the Nile, or Messina, and that at its confluence of the Limpopo and the Sand rivers in southern Africa? Why Jericho, that actually doesn't sit on a river and is some miles away from the river? Why do they choose Jericho? So in 2019, we of Campaign for Truth and Iron Anti-Semitism decided to investigate, and we became aware of a policy of Palestinianism that's infiltrating the UK schools. It's already infiltrating across Western schools, as Richard's going to discuss today. We have therefore implemented a strategy of research and of action. We have written via local MP Mike Freer to the Home Secretary, the Right Honourable Priti Patel, asking that she look into this as an urgent matter. And you can read the letter there that we've written to her. For if we are to avoid what has happened in our university, it is almost a complete admission of propagandist infiltration. We need to act now. We ask, therefore, any of you who wish to contribute in any way to this project and to this work, please step forward. You can either donate towards our researchers, you can carry out research yourself, and you can simply send us material you might come across via personal experience, or maybe that you might read or hear about in your daily doings. So what I say to you is, please come with us on this journey, help us, let's put it together as one concerted effort so that we can make sure that our schools do not turn into what has happened in the universities. And so this year we're going to have a series of talks to keep us all updated and informed. And before I introduce you to the first speaker, I'd like to look forward to just a couple of weeks. In this very room, we're going to be having NGO Monitor, who's taking the next step in this talk, who's going to be briefing us and talking about Palestinian NGOs and education in Israel. So without anything further for me to say, I'm going to introduce you here to Richard, who's speaking in our series. Most of you here, I would imagine, are acquainted with Richard. And you'll see, you've all got one of these. And these are Richard's definitions, and I think if you've heard Richard talk, you know that he has a very distinct terminology that most of us tend to understand, but many don't. So with his help, we've prepared the card. You can read it, you can take it home with you. And when you read his articles, it will be rather helpful to know not only what his definitions are, but how he thinks and puts things together. So we welcome Richard, and Lisa's already told you about his fame of creating the word Pallywood. Pallywood is the film output of the Palestinians. They make fake videos and movies and create the kind of indoctrination that is going into our schools. So Rich uses the word millennialism a lot. He's a professor of millennialism.
It's not
or was at Boston University. So for those of you who don't know, millennialism is a belief advanced by some religious denominations that a golden age or paradise will occur here on earth prior to the final judgment and the future eternal state of the world to come. Is that right?
Well, there are secular versions. Communism is a millennial belief set.
But it's that nirvana that's going to be created.
Well, it's this perfect society on earth, perfect equality, perfect happiness, abundance.
So Richard's going to take over.
All right, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you all for coming on a cold wintry night. So what I'd like to do is just briefly go over these terms, all of which come from a 4-page glossary to my unpublished book entitled They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid, a Medievalist Guide to the 21st Century. The epigram to which is, if I were a Muslim, I would take the stupidity of Westerners as a sign from Allah that I should join jihad. Because indeed, Westerners have behaved for the last 20 years with a really remarkable, when I say Westerners, primarily I mean the sort of thought leaders of our time, have behaved in some truly counterproductive ways. We don't need that right now. So the first term here is cognitive warfare. It's not my term. A student of mine independently worked on this for military intelligence. Cognitive war is the war that the weak side undertakes in a asymmetrical battle with the stronger side. It can't win on the battlefield, what's called the kinetic war, so it turns to cognitive war. And the purpose of cognitive war, in the terms of one of my colleagues in Israel, is to make patriots of your own people and pacifists of your enemy. And another way to put it is, it's designed to convince your much stronger enemy not to use his spirit of strength. Now, most of this kind of asymmetrical warfare is normally undertaken by small places that have been invaded by big imperial powers. So, for example, the Maccabees is a good example, recent at least in our memories. The Viet Cong fighting against the United States was a good example of an asymmetrical war, and in fact there are people who argue, and I would tend to agree with them, that that battle was actually won on the cognitive battlefield. They convinced the Americans not to stay and not to fight. And they did that largely through their manipulation of journalists and the anti-war movement in the West. Now, what we're dealing with today is something that's fairly unusual, and the only other example that I can think of, or I should say, I'm beginning to rethink this, the only really clear example that I can think of that compares with the war that's being waged by what I'll call caliphaters, and explain in a moment, would be the Soviet efforts to invade the West in the Cold War. But I won't go into that. But the point of invasive Cog War is, when I first started working on this, I remember I spoke to a lady, and she said, "So what are you working on?" I said, "Cognitive warfare." "What is it?" "Well, it's convincing your stronger enemy not to use his weapons, and I'm working on a particularly peculiar case in which it's invasive Cog War, which means that the weaker side is invading the stronger side and using cognitive war to get them not to resist the invasion." And she said, "Well, that would be incredibly stupid. Who would do that?" So there was a long pause, and she went, "Oh, well, I think I know what you mean." Okay, So, invasive Cogwar. Now, who are the people who are engaged in this invasive Cogwar? And here I come with a term that I really like, but I can't say is caught on like wildfire, which is Caliphaters. Now, Caliphaters are, and I got this from them, actually, there's a hashtag called Caliphate Generation, hashtag Caliphate Generation. Caliphaters are, by my definition, an apocalyptic millennial movement. And that means that they're a movement that believes that their idea of heaven on earth, their idea of the Messianic age, is about to happen. The apocalyptic means it's about to happen. I would say that probably 90% of Christians, 85% of Jews, and 95% of Muslims believe that at some point, when the end time comes, that everybody will become them or be subject to them or whatever. The dangerous part of millennial movements, the idea of a millennium or the idea of a messianic age is embedded in all monotheism. The danger comes when people believe that it's happening now. And so I define those Muslims who believe that in this generation, or if we want to extend it, in this century, which started in 1979 and will end in 2076, that in this generation, or at most in this century, Islam will take over the world. Or to paraphrase Freud, where there was Dar al-Harb, that is the realm of the sword, which is us, there shall be Dar al-Islam. This is about, let's say, 10% of the population today. It's hard to know. There are concentric circles of hardcore people who have dedicated their entire lives to it, and circles of sympathy, of sort of part-time participation and whatever. The really important reason why using the term Caliphater is important is that there are two kinds of Caliphaters, and there's a pretty fluid, we're told that gender is fluid. Well, in this case, there's a lot of fluidity between these two types. One is the jihadis, who believe that only through violence and destruction will the caliphate, the universal caliphate, come about. And then there are others who believe that it will happen through dawah. And dawah is the term which literally in Arabic means summons. And it's a call to the true religion. All right, so dawah caliphaters are invasive cog warriors. That's who they are. They are in the process, and we have a great quote from Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's the sort of TV star of the Muslim Brotherhood, enormously popular, widely read, and by some of our intelligence experts, and here we come into the terrain of giant stupidity, considered a moderate because he doesn't, well, because they say he doesn't support violence, said, through dawah, we don't need jihad. Through dawah, Europe and the United States will be common. So this is and you have to understand, I wrote a book on this, it's called Heaven on Earth, about apocalyptic millennial movements. When people become members of these kinds of movements, their life is filled with a meaning that most of us can't really understand. They will sacrifice their lives, they will sacrifice other people's lives, they will dedicate every fiber of their being towards bringing about this universal redemption, which is how they see it. So, caliphaters, it's important, and my focus is going to be on the dawah caliphaters, because those are the people who are invading the schools. Those are the people who are going after any means whereby they can indoctrinate people to accept Islam as the true religion. Or, basically, a caliphater offers the infidel three choices. Anybody know what they are? Death, convert,
Dimitude.
dimitude. Death convert dimitude.
It's accepting an inferior status.
That's our
Pay
next
extra
term.
taxes and
Right.
constant state of humiliation.
Dimitude is the degraded status of infidels in the land governed by Sharia, which means essentially, at the initial spread of Islam, the Christians and the Jews were granted this subservient status, and as long as they accepted that subservient status, they were protected, which is how the term is normally defined, but protected from what? They're protected from Muslim violence. The heathen, the idol worshippers, were not protected from the violence. They didn't get to have access to this dhimmi status, and as a result, they would be killed. But the point about the status of the dhimmi is that if the dhimmi does something to break the contract, then they are subject to violence. They have lost the protection of dimitude. For me, I want to argue, and I think it's terribly important for us to understand this today, the single most important requirement of dimitude, and there are a whole range of them about how high you can build your church spires and whether you can repair, you have to ask permission to repair your places of worship, and you can only ride donkeys, you can't ride horses, and you have to walk in the gutter when a Muslim's coming down the street. All sorts of obvious, open, physical expressions of the superiority of the Muslim to the infidel. But the most important job of the dhimmi is not to criticize Islam or Muslims. That is blasphemy. And repeatedly in the history of Islam, when people, even when they haven't said something, but they're accused of having said something blasphemous, and this is happening even today, it can be essentially a death sentence for the person being accused of this. Proleptic dimitude, proleptic meaning anticipatory, in anticipation, even before it happens, you adopt the behavior of the dhimmi in order to avoid retaliation. And I think that many of our leaders have unconsciously, I don't think they're formally doing this, and I think they tell themselves a story in which they're being generous and kind and tolerant and open, but essentially what we have before us is a leadership which systematically not only avoids criticizing Muslims, but attacks people who do criticize Muslims, because that's the job of a dhimmi leader throughout the history of Islam for the last 1,400 years. The job of the leadership of the dhimmi community is to make sure that the members of their community don't upset the Muslims. We'll come back to this issue of Islamophobia. Okay, so Islamophobia is the next term. Islamophobia, in my read, has two different definitions. One definition is the definition in which Islamophobia is like racism. It's an irrational hostility to anybody who's a Muslim. Doesn't matter what they're like, doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter what their beliefs are. If they're Muslims, they're terrible, I hate them, I don't want to have anything to do with them. It's a form of racism, and it's something that I think we all need to oppose. However, the dhimmi definition of Islamophobia is anybody who criticizes Islam. Anybody who says, which out for jihad, jihad is connected, and we had this situation, talk about proleptic dhimmi. Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General of the United States under Obama, was being questioned on Capitol Hill about radical Islam, and he literally refused to say the word radical Islam. He would not say radical Islam, because to say radical Islam would be to suggest that there was something connected between Islam and jihad. And even to do that was to call into question a narrative in which Islam is a religion of peace, the jihadis are not true Muslims, they've hijacked the religion, and anybody who draws any connection between the two is an Islamophobe. And I think that it's terribly important not to allow caliphators, Dawa caliphators, to define what Islamophobia is, because they will define anything that calls attention to caliphator behavior as Islamophobia. And so essentially, they not only do they invade us, they forbid us to talk about the invasion. And if we can't stop, so one of my themes tonight is we have to figure out how to challenge this issue of Islamophobia and the hysteria that overcomes people like Marie and other members of the community who essentially go after somebody like Melanie Phillips, who definitely speaks in harsh terms, but not unjustifiably. And so, just to jump ahead to where I want to end up, I think it's terribly important for us to develop something which caliphators are very good at, which is the good cop, tough cop routine. If Melanie wants to play the tough cop and write about the deranged quality of the dhimmi definition of Islamophobia, the job of the Jewish community is not to jump all over and say, hey, we're good Jews, we would never say anything like that, and she's a horrible Jew, and we don't want to have anything to do with her. It's to say, listen, she may be speaking harshly, but I think you have to understand where she's coming from. And it's not like, you guys don't speak harshly. I mean, what is this unbelievable sensitivity to criticism when you have no hesitations about criticizing Westerners, Israelis, Jews who support Israel? You have no problem with it. So, ma pitom, we can't criticize you. And I think that that tough cop, nice cop routine is something that we have to develop extensively. Okay, I'm going to skip supersessionism. I'm going to skip shame, honor. We can go to that later. Oh, wait, there's a back of the page. A replacement. Oh, liberal cognitive egocentrism. The term cognitive egocentrism was coined by a therapist who, in the 1960s, was working with teenage boys. And he realized that teenage boys had the remarkable tendency to project their mentality onto everybody. They thought about sex all the time, and they assumed that everybody else thought about sex all the time. Liberal cognitive egocentrism is projecting a liberal mindset onto everybody, whether they share that mindset or not. And that's the point of my book, A Medievalist Guide to the 21st Century, because we medievalists deal with people who do not have liberal mindsets. We just came from seeing Richard III. They don't have liberal mindsets. They don't live in a world where the rules are the rules that we assume everybody should take. I once had a student in my class complain that Daniel Goldhagen's book about Hitler's willing executioners was not good history because it demonized the Germans. And I said, it dehumanized the Germans. I said, what do you mean dehumanized the Germans? He said, well, he depicts them as sadists. I said, do you know any animals who are sadistic? I mean, sadism is one of the most peculiarly human traits. And what I realized was she was confusing human and humane. He dehumanized, he depicted them as not humane, but he certainly didn't depict them as not human. And so, again, this liberal cognitive egocentrism confuses human and humane and assumes that everybody shares our humane attitudes. And that can be a very dangerous thing. The last term I want to talk about is demopath, which was first inspired by reading the story, which I've since confirmed, that Muhammad Atta, who was one of the Magnificent 19 who did 9/11, before that went to the American Agricultural Department and asked them for a loan of $600,000 for a crop duster for which he wanted to buy huge tanks. And what he wanted to do was to fill them with poison gas and fly over neighborhoods and spray the neighborhoods with this poison gas. And the woman who was in charge said, we can't give you the loan because you're not an American citizen. And his response was to accuse her of racism. And I thought about it, and in fact, one of the people who let one of the guys through in 9/11, one of the hijackers, he let him through because he didn't want to appear prejudiced. He was afraid that if he were to say, you know, you look suspicious to me, that he would be accused of Islamophobia, even though Islamophobia wasn't a big term back in 2001. So the point of Demopass is that they use the language of human rights to demand for themselves a whole series of advantages, even though they have no commitment to human rights whatsoever, and in fact want to destroy the system of human rights that they're appealing to be empowered. It's a tremendous Cogwar technique. It's done very well. David Collier back there has just done a study of Amnesty International. The major NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, and so on, have all become either outright Demopass or dupes of Demopass. In other words, they believe when the Palestinians say the Israelis have taken away our human rights, as if they had those human rights before, as if any Arab regime gives any Arab commoner, citizen, they're not even citizens, I believe the term in Richard III was abjects, not even subjects, but abjects. When they complain that Israel has taken away their human rights, it's a ludicrous argument. Israel hasn't given them all the human rights that they would like, for good reason. A lot of them want to destroy the state of Israel. And yet, organizations like Amnesty International and stuff just gobble this stuff up. So there's the Demopass and the dupes of Demopass. All right, enough of this. Let me now go on to some remarks using this language. All right. Before I begin, I'd like to make a couple of introductory remarks. First, I'd like to doff my cap in appreciation to the British people who voted against Jeremy Corbyn. I gotta tell you, I passed some rather anxious hours, and when I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning and looked at my, all right. Not only because he promoted Jew hatred, for which I thank the British people as a Jew, but also, and far more consequentially, it seems to me, because Corbyn was a major promoter of caliphators, even of jihadis, for which I thank the British voters as a member of a free democratic society. May future developments continue to distance the voting public throughout the West from Caliphater Demopass and their Western progressive dupes, aka proleptic vimy. And may the inhabitants of Western democracies like Britain and the US and Israel and France and Germany raise up wise leaders who can perceive the dangers without turning into the equally irrational opposite of the caliphators. Second, before I begin using this vocabulary, let me clarify, caliphators are still the small minority of Muslims. I'm not talking about Islam or all Muslims. I'm talking about those who have been drawn towards the black hole of an apocalyptic millennial movement that wants, at any cost of destruction, to conquer the world. And Robert Lifton wrote a book about Om Shinrikyo called Destroying the World to Save It, which is the definition of what I call cataclysmic active apocalyptic. In other words, the apocalypse, the transformation from this world of evil and suffering and whatever else to the perfect world of collective salvation will occur only through vast destruction, and we are the agents of that destruction. So, for example, Christian in America, we have a lot of premillennial dispensationalist Christians who believe in the rapture. They believe that from here to the millennium, there will be a vast amount of destruction. But God does it, not man. When man does it, then you've got a recipe for megadeath. And in my book, I deal with the Taiping, who killed 20 to 35 million people in China around the same time, middle of the 19th century, a chapter on the communists, a chapter on the Nazis, and of course a chapter on the Caliphaters, although I hadn't come up with the term when I wrote that chapter. So, I'm not talking about Islam or all Muslims. I'm talking about those who've been drawn into the black hole of an apocalyptic movement. Initially, in 1400 Annus Hejira, anybody know what year 1400 Annus Hejira was? Well, no, it's from the move to Medina in 622, 1400. They lose 3 years a century because they stick to the lunar calendar. 1979, the year that Iran went to Khomeini, was the year 1400, and that's the beginning of the global caliphate movement that we're seeing today, and which has essentially gone from a bunch of guys holed up in the Afghan caves, mountain caves, to a movement that is really quite substantial. All right. In 1400, there were only a few, maybe a million, but now there are surely tens of millions, even though that means it's still only about 10% of Muslims. The key question is, what's the relationship of this hardcore and the rest of the Ummah? How many non or not yet Caliphater Muslims may quietly admire them? From enthusiasts of jihadi violence to admirers of Dawah steadfast faith. After all, supremacism has been a key, but hopefully not essential, dimension of Islam till now, and those caliphators who assert that dominion prematurely, in other words, they jump the gun, may embarrass their fellow Muslims, but don't necessarily offend them. How all that plays out, we cannot know, but it's a battle for hearts and minds in the Ummah, that is the Muslims around the world, democracy and freedom of religion on the one hand, or caliphate and religious supremacism on the other. We cannot assume that freedom will win. In the meantime, I focused here on the active players that I can see at work, the demopathic Dawah caliphators and their high-level dupes. Now let's state some of our current dilemma in the 21st century using this terminology that I've just introduced, and then go to the issue of schools as a major battleground. Dawah caliphators are waging a generations-long invasive Cogwar against democratic cultures around the world. 1979 to 2076, namely 1400 to 1500. Making demopathic demands for the fullest rights and respect for Muslims in the Western public sphere and the highest platforms in democracy in order to disseminate their dawah, their call to their summons, in order to dismantle the very system of rights upon which they rise. They use the notion of Islamophobia, which should mean a racist hatred of all Muslims, as a Cogwar shield from criticism, as a means to stop any public discussion of Caliphater Cogwar. Indeed, the Runnymede Trust definition of Islamophobia is literally a demopath's delight. Islamophobia is any distinction, exclusion, or restriction towards or preference against Muslims or those perceived to be Muslims that has the purpose of effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, and any other field of public life. Right? In other words, if you don't grant Muslims the fullest range of human rights and equality, then you are an Islamophobe. And the idea that they might use these badly is itself a form of Islamophobia. After 9/11, and in England after 7/7, Dawah caliphators were in trouble. How to explain the murderous rage of caliphator jihadis who called for genocidal slaughter on the way to global conquest? One way is you get the infidels not to talk about the genocidal stuff. They responded by insisting on a demopathic counter-narrative that Islam is a religion of peace, that Muslim armies have been liberators, tolerant rulers, promoters of women's rights and equality. For instance, shame murderers and vaginal cutting are not Islamic. That jihad meant internal struggle to become a better person that had nothing to do with the crazy jihadis who would attack the religion to hijack the religion to attack Westerners, which we, true, moderate, peaceful Muslims, totally condemn. And anyone who questioned this narrative or tied Islam to the violent jihadis was an Islamophobe who contributed to the clash of civilizations. How? By affirming the jihadi narrative that the West was at war with Islam. This was incidentally Hillary Clinton's repeated comment about why she didn't want to talk about radical Islam or anything like that, because what it would do would be to affirm the narrative of the jihadis that the West was at war with Islam. And of course, it's important for the jihadis and their recruiting of Muslims to say, look, the West is out against us all, and so you have to join us to defend against this Western assault. The effect of this, essentially, was to say, we cannot speak of the assault for fear that will make it worse, which is a brilliant Cogwar strategy. Checkmate. Jihadi caliphators declare war on the West, and Da'i caliphators forbid the targets, namely us infidels, from talking about it. Over the last 20 years, the West has shown itself quite vulnerable to this Cogwar invasion. On the one hand, Western post-colonial thought lines up closely with this agenda, including, surprisingly, feminists who managed to overlook Muslim and Islamic hostility to women in their eagerness to denounce Western patriarchy. On the other hand, Western liberals are easily shamed into virtue signaling that they are not racist or even a little bit prejudiced, especially about Muslims. Caliphater Democrats readily exploit this weakness and demand full respect for Islam. In conceding to these demands, these Western actors have convinced themselves that they uphold, indeed advance dramatically, progressive causes and values, even if, in adopting the Dawah narrative and ignoring the jihadi one, they do just what the caliphators want. Or, to paraphrase Jose Saramago, who wrote this revolting screed against the Jews, not the Israelis, against the Jews, in 2002 after visiting, what's his name, Arafat. He just went on a rant about the Jews and how they think they're the chosen people and they're so disgusting and so on and so forth. And he said that the Jews wanted to turn the rest of the world, the Gentiles, into a docile echo of their will. But that's exactly what the caliphators want to do. They want to turn us into a docile echo of their will. Repeating the Dawah narrative in the last generation has gotten professors jobs, funding, centers for teaching. Hence, academia has no place for the study of jihad. One student of jihad told me that he was in graduate school on 9/11, wanting to study Rumi's poetry, and when he decided to study jihad, his professors explained to him he would have to leave the academy. And indeed he did. He's in the think tank. But anybody who wants to go into the study of jihad is going to have a hard time in the academy. My friend David Cook, who works on Muslim apocalyptic thought, which is just horrendous stuff, his book was initially rejected by readers who said it was Islamophobic. So, here you have, you're accusing the researcher of hate speech for reporting the hate speech of Muslims. As a result of this Dawah narrative, adopting this Dawah narrative, many of our leaders have proleptically come to behave as dhimmi. In the most crucial sense of the term for Muslims, above all, dhimmi must not criticize Muslims or Islam. It's blasphemy. This means they must attack the enemies, critics of Islam and Muslims, especially within their own communities. This explains why the denunciation of fellow Jews is so common by people who have adopted the Dawa narrative. Good Jews must visibly and loudly show they disapprove of Islamophobes like Melanie Phillips, who have the strife-causing temerity to criticize Islamist tendencies of Islam. They're making this all so much worse. That is, people like Melanie. Now let me turn to the schools. Obviously, any invasive Cogwar wants to reach people early with their message. The sooner, the better. All Messianic millenary movements place immense value on education. Some of us might call it brainwashing. So among the material developed for the Dawa invasion of the West, curricular materials for high schools and even younger were prepared to enforce the democratic narrative of an Islam of peace and tolerance. Ideally, they would like to turn the schools into Caliphater recruiting grounds. So, in any assessment of the Caliphater result on the West, one has to look at the schools as a major battleground, rather than assume that, absence of visible evidence, little importance is happening. And I think that that's one of the things you guys should be praised and credited for, which is to focus on something that unless you look for it, you're not going to notice it. It's just not going to be there. And one of the reasons is the intimidation factor, which I'll get back to in a moment. All right, so the Trojan horse strategy is laid out in the Birmingham school scandal. It's a perfect description of the Dawa Cogwar strategy. And here I'm reading from this letter that was discovered and handed over, and some people claim it's fake, but at least the stuff I read on the analysis of why it's fake is really not convincing. And as a medievalist who actually worked on fakes and knows how to decide when something's a fake, it was clear that they just didn't want to deal with this topic. So here this is a summary given by somebody else of this letter, but it's a perfect description both of what the content of the letter and the Dawa Cogwar strategy. The letter outlined a 5-stage strategy called Operation Trojan Horse. Step 1, identify vulnerable schools where most of the pupils are Muslim. Next, identify a group of sympathetic parents to agitate for an Islamic agenda. Then, which includes things like agitate against the teaching of Holocaust studies and stuff because it offends them. Then put in place governors who adhere to the same conservative Islamic beliefs. Next, identify staff to disrupt the school from within by changing the rules and undermining sympathetic colleagues. In other words, get rid of the people who stand in your way. And finally, run anonymous letter and PR campaigns with the aim of forcing the head teacher to resign so that they can be replaced by one who works for us. The subsequent scandal and ultimate dismissal of the complaints against some of the key Muslim educational activists offer a landscape from pure demopathy, ta'ir alam, and proleptic dimitude, the Professor John Holmwood, who wrote a whole book saying this is all nonsense. Our schools are, like so many other cultural institutions, vulnerable to Dawa Cogwar, which demands of the infidels, students, teachers, staff, that they not insult Islam by objecting to its imposition. The attacks take place along a wide range of themes and venues, from extraordinary events like visits and talks from the likes of Zumla, to curricular materials, to changing the school rules to accord with Sharia, to public shaming that forces infidel teachers and administrators to conform with a Dawa narrative lest they be outed as Islamophobes. The attack comes in all kinds of forms: demands for the rights of Muslim students to follow their own rules, and eventually for everyone to conform to Sharia measures like the segregation of the sexes, or not eating publicly during Ramadan, the rights of Muslim students not to feel denigrated or dismissed, the pressure to convert to Islam, the pressure not to mention the pressure, the tense, even explosive atmosphere around these issues, and the mainstreaming of anti-Zionist materials, including the rejection of any mention of the Holocaust. Caliphater bullies versus Western bullied. When authorities are bullied, they side with the bully. In France in the early aughts, that's the first decade of the 21st century, when the Muslims started bullying Jewish kids, there's a terrible book which has been translated into English called Rising from the Muck by Pierre-André Taguieff. Oh, no, this is a different, it's called The Lost Territories of the Republic, and it's about the schools, basically, particularly in Muslim neighborhoods, just being taken over. So when Jewish kids were being bullied, the parents would go to the principal of the school, and the principal of the school would say, why don't you put your kid in a Jewish school? Which meant he lost Jewish students, and he gained Muslim bullies. So it was a disaster for the school on two counts. In Birmingham, when teachers complained, they were moved elsewhere. Of course, the school loses double. I'll just say this. In schools with many Muslims, like Fitzallen High in Cardiff, the small but powerful coalition radicals could dominate the public sphere, pressuring Muslim and non-Muslim girls into wearing hijab and infidel teachers into not reporting worrisome behavior. You've got accounts of teachers who try and report this, and it just gets them into trouble. In the Middle Ages, there was an unfortunate tradition of killing bearers of bad tidings, and which is really counterintuitive, and that's what's going on here. Add to that, school administrators eager to avoid shame for failure and curry the favor of a good reputation in a wider range of information professionals, academics and journalists equally eager to dismiss as baseless and without evidence as fake news. Here I'm basically paraphrasing John Homewood. As fake news, any claim that Islamization is happening. John Homestead, for example, refers dismissively to the Trojan horse hoax and blindly describes the substantive investigations as having turned up no evidence. And yet, viewed from the perspective of the da'is, that's people who do dawah, you have a training ground for caliphators of every stripe, from jihadis ready to go off to the Middle East to the next generation of teachers. I'd like here, in conclusion, to look not at England, about which I know less, but the US, in particular Newton High School, about which I know a lot more because I used to live next door in Brookline and Brighton, and a lot of my friends live there. I picked this example for a number of reasons. Newton is not some peripheral place where you can pull the wool over the eyes of local yokels. It has a high percentage of information and therapy professionals deeply embedded in the highest levels of the Boston intelligentsia, and among them a high percentage of helicopter parents who want the best education for their kids. A great deal of money and effort goes into making Newton Public Schools a match for the highest standards of the larger public, top of the line. Here we have a visible process of Dawah Cogwar work. Elements of the academy, in this case prestigious Harvard, funded by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, producing post-colonial curricula, i.e. the Dawah narrative, for high schools taught by activist teachers. One small detail gives a good sense of the intellectual corruption involved. By the POCO post-colonial paradigm, Hamas are resistors to colonial imperial hegemony, and so genocidal passages of Jew hatred don't exactly fit the narrative. Accordingly, in the school textbooks, the Hamas charter, which is a textbook case in the study of Caliphater paranoid violence, wherever it said Yahud, al-Yahud, the Jews, these curricular activists translated Zionists. So it calls for the extermination of the Jews, but the students are told it's calling for getting rid of the Zionists.
And the BBC did the same thing.
What?
And the BBC
did the same thing and defended. right? And one of the teachers justified the substitution in his teaching notes. I would assert this is not inherently a religious conflict, it's conflict over land. So all evidence it's a religious conflict gets washed out of the materials in order to make the case that, which they want to make, that this is about land, which means if only Israel gave a little more, there would be peace.
Richard, can I interrupt here? But
Yes.
on those SACRA, every authority in the country has a standing committee for religious education.
Yes.
And increasingly, we have two Muslim representatives, and they are trying to politicise religious education. And one of them wanted to get a message that Zionism is Jewish extremism across. It was rejected by the SACRA. I don't know what's happened in other ones. But you've got this constant attempt to politicise the SACRAs. It just reinforces what you said.
Right. More broadly as well, the new teaching materials conform to the Dawa Caliphater narrative. Islamophobia is the most violent and pressing of religious hatreds. Islam is a religion of peace. Muslims through history have been tolerant of minorities. One observer noticed the absence of criticism and wrote, it's all very disturbing in terms of an unwillingness to delve into topics of Islamic radicalism or the ways in which extremists use Islamic doctrine to promote totalitarian and misogynistic ideologies that have managed to attract a substantial following. Not the Western meaning of Islamophobia, an irrational hatred of all Muslims, which all decent people oppose, but the Muslim meaning, anything that offends Muslim honor. And all of this post-colonial replacement narrative is riddled with pervasive violations of all the rules of intellectual integrity, from false, incorrect, unsubstantiated assertions that riddle this propaganda, to the pervasive failures on the part of responsible people to raise any objections. While the formal teaching guides ask questions, is it a conflict over religion or land, the teacher's notes expect the teacher to steer the discussion in the right direction. When some of the parents got wind of this curricular development, and this is where it really gets depressing, kids coming home and asking, does the Israeli government and military really torture and murder Palestinian women? Some complained. And the principal and the superintendent of schools, both Jewish, stonewalled. And the principal, after only a short period of defending the indefensible, at least by the principles they allegedly upheld, they ended up sounding like demopaths pretending to uphold principles they actually violate. Here, the deputy superintendent of schools, Anne Frederick, explained to concerned parents that assigning material with incorrect information, even if the purpose of using the materials to present supposedly factual information to the students could be beneficial because it would sharpen the students' critical thinking skills. Let the teachers use false propaganda to brainwash our kids. It'll be good for their critical thinking skills. Apparently, the administrations have no problem spouting ludicrous claims that sound good. Incidentally, there's an interesting parallel here with journalists who won't call jihadis who target children terrorists because if they do, their reporters are in danger from jihadi reprisal. Explained Reuters' global managing editor in 2004 with a magnificent oxymoron. My goal is to protect our reporters and protect our editorial integrity. Not protect our reporters at the cost of our intellectual integrity. Indeed, the extensive resistance to parental complaints from teachers and school administrators may be the most disturbing aspect of this story, and I hate to say it, to indicate to you all here that if you take on this thing, you're in for a lot of resistance. Some, primarily the teachers, acted from deep ideological conviction. Others, primarily the administrators, from a desire to avoid looking bad. The critical issue in the case of the administrators, who is the peer group to whose judgment worried them far more than the parents? In other words, they're ready to say, really dismissive stuff to the parents, like, oh, this is good for your students' critical thinking. They clearly don't care about the parents. Who do they care about? Here we come to the core of the problem, I think. A brief glance at the rest of the social studies curriculum indicates that it hews closely to the Dawa counter-narrative. Islam, religion of peace, Islamophobe, anyone who questions that assertion. The term Islamophobia is the key problem. It only has power because we, the speakers of the tongue, give it power. In other words, how did it come about that the very accusation, however inaccurate and unfair, that someone is an Islamophobe can be a career ender? What is the electric charge of moral panic that rushes through the minds of people who hear that they might be called an Islamophobe, or that they might have been associating with somebody who might be called an Islamophobe? How could fear of the banishment it portended have paralyzed men and women in charge of our communities into, in the case of Rotherham and other places, sacrificing daughters into the maw of the sexual jihad that fueled triumphalist Caliphater circles of all kinds? Nothing, certainly in an honor-shame culture, is more contemptible than a man who will not protect his women. Caliphaters 10, Brits minus 10. In 2000, only weeks after the outbreak of the Westerner, of what the Westerners call the Second Intifada, an imam named Halawi wrote an apocalyptic screed entitled "The Day of Wrath is the Intifada of Rajab," which was the month that it began in, only the beginning. In it he wrote, if the justness of the cause is the spiritual foundation of the fighter, then those who oppose us, like the Zionists, are not only unjust, but it is their duty to fight for our sons. When I read it at the time, I was struck by how deftly the author invoked the curses of the prophets as directives to jihadis to punish the Jews for their evil ways. In other words, when Jeremiah says these things are going to happen to you because you're bad, the jihadis say, oh, and we're going to impose the punishment, shaping an active cataclysmic apocalyptic scenario for redemption. At the time, I thought it a joke that the Zionists or Western progressives would actually fight for the opposing side. At the time, I didn't know about Cogwar, nor did I imagine that Westerners would be so feckless in defending their hard-won freedoms and dignity. Today, I realize he called it. Westerners think it's their duty to fight for the enemy. I'm afraid I can't offer much advice on what to do, at least for the moment. I'll focus on raising awareness of the problem and resistance to seeing the problem. I'm not going to go into this. What I do want to go into is this issue of Islamophobia. I think that making it a major project to challenge, I tried to challenge Marie van der Zijl when I met her recently, and I tried to follow up with an email, but we'll see if I get an answer. But I think it is incumbent on everybody, and to do it without using foul language and denouncing them as a bunch of whatevers, just patiently and calmly say that Marie van der Zijl said to me, Melanie Phillips crossed a line. And I said, what line did she cross? And she said, I want to talk about it. Listen, it was Shabbos, I understand. She came to show solidarity with South Hempstead synagogue and so on. So I understand she didn't want to. That's why I followed up the next day. But the point is, we really need to challenge people when they say this is outrageous. We need to say, what did she say that was so outrageous? When Marlon Solomon, who I saw his performance this summer when I was at Oxford at ISCAP, I thought it was brilliant. We had a great evening discussing it, but then, you know, I see that he's on Twitter saying Melanie Phillips is, you know, what was the term, Mark?
Full frontal racist bile.
Yes, full frontal racist bile.
Oh, yeah,
So the point is, on the one hand, they shouldn't be allowed to do this. Ultimately, I think they should be shamed for behaving like a bunch of thimmies for doing it. I think it's terribly important to say, why are you so hysterical? Yes, you want to make a comment? Yeah.
Yeah, sort of make a couple of points actually. First of all,
Calder's position was probably instructed by Barack
Oh,
Obama,
absolutely.
number one.
Absolutely.
Number two,
Yes.
Bridget gave, I challenge what I consider to be your low estimate of the number of caliphators, and people might not put their fingers in the ears when I say fellators, Bridget gave estimates them at about 25 to 35%, and she cites CIA, whatever, figures. But even if you don't believe that figure, you don't have to look very far for the Guardian survey, and jointly done by Trevor Phillips' team, which showed that 40% of Muslims in the UK would like to see Sharia law imposed.
Right.
It's not a great stretch of the imagination to suggest where that's going to go. And also on the point about Melanie Phillips. Melanie Phillips wasn't the only person called out. Rod Liddell was called out for saying almost exactly the same thing on the Sun.
Who was?
Rod Liddell. And
Also the Jewish Chronicles own people, Daniel Sugarman.
well, Dan Sugar was a complete idiot, but look, that's enough time for that.
He now runs the PR of the Board of Deputies.
Yeah, but just one last point. As campaign, as the folks who've organised tonight will know very well, and Rod has highlighted it. Anyone who follows Rod Liddell will know this. If you looked at the last, let's say, 25 terrorist attacks in the UK and Europe, pretty much 98% of them, the BBC will not report the religion of the person who carried it out until the Sun and the Mail and others say it was Islamist. And then eventually maybe the BBC will mention it at some point, and usually the next line after, and I say this as someone who used to work for the BBC 20 years, usually the next line in the press about that person, oh, he definitely had mental health issues. And nobody who actually said that has got a single medical qualification whatsoever.
Question. How many lone wolves or mentally ill lone wolves does it take to form a caliphate?
Right. No, I mean, you just had this case of the guy who killed Sarah Halimi in France. And, I mean, that was a terrifying case. But the minute they arrested him, they took him to a mental hospital. They didn't even take him to
So,
prison.
Richard, that case is spoken about in the film Homeland that was made by Katie Hopkins.
Yes, which I saw.
We viewed that film, and Ambrosine and I got attacked by 3 of the top leaders of our community for being Islamophobes. And they will not acknowledge now that that man is not going to court for slaughtering a woman in the most vile way.
Torturing her while reciting the Quran.
That is what Homelands was about, and Roger there knows that. Quite a few people here were at that film. You've seen it. And we have been completely blackballed by our community because we showed that film. We've had the same letter written, the same accusation that Melanie's got. It's appalling.
I've been chucked off the campaign for anti-Semitism because they looked at my Facebook, they thought I was Islamophobic. Kisharon, I was chucked off as well. And I go to Henry Jackson lectures, and they are all dimmies, if you know.
Henry Jackson?
Really?
Isn't that where Douglas Murray is?
A few, not all, but some of the speakers.
Look, if Colonel Richard Kemp can be deplatformed by WASI and Telmana UK and Fiat Magal and the Board of Deputies and the CS and everyone, and called Islamophobic, if Colonel Richard Kemp, what?
So wasn't there just an apology made to him?
Yes, it was concocted apology. It was concocted apology. Because they made it out now that Richard Kemp had to withdraw from that CAA event because he had conflicting arrangements.
Yes, which is not true.
And that's illegal, that's what they put forward legally and factually, but actually behind the scenes he had to withdraw because of the smears.
So Richard Kemp said he withdrew because of everything that was going on. He said it himself.
But have you seen the JC article saying he withdrew because of conflicting arrangements?
Yes, I saw that, and I was struck by that.
Look, that was an agreed apology.
We have a comment here?
I'm not sorry.
I can answer your question as to why Marie Van der Zil and people like her will not talk about this topic. They are heavily invested in interfaith work. And I went along to one of these at Woodside Park Synagogue.
You were allowed in.
I was allowed in, I didn't know what I was going to say, and there was an imam and a rabbi, and everyone was being ever so nice to each other.
Kumbaya.
And the rabbi was asked to give one word of wisdom, sentence of wisdom from the Torah, and same for the imam, one sentence of wisdom from the Quran. And he said, did you know that, and he's talking to about 150 Jews from the synagogue, and saying, did you know that Islam reserves special treatment for Jews and Christians? And so I thought, I'm going to ask him a question. Everyone was asking really nice, jokey questions, and came to me, and I said, your point about, was all about dhimmihood. I said, some of us are educated ourselves in Islam, and we know exactly what we mean. As my ancestors came from Iraq, and we lived like dhimmis. So don't try and fool this audience that it's a good thing. It's not a good thing, it's a bad thing. And they all the Jews looked at me as though I was the top maker, like, what are you doing? And they were all listening to each other. And that's the answer. And the chief rabbi is as heavily invested in all of this faith, and he will not say one word of criticism against their fellow Muslim clerics who are involved.
One moment. I was in a dialogue group after 9/11, actually after the outbreak of the Intifada in Boston, and then the suicide bombing started. In January 1st, 2001 was the first suicide bombing after the outbreak of the Intifada, and I remember that the Arabs in the group were all saying, oh, now Israel's going to go crazy and slaughter Arabs and stuff. And it took Ariel Sharon over a year before he finally responded to them, and that was the Jenin campaign. And at one point, I was really outraged. Here they were saying, oh, now the Israelis are going to start slaughtering us. You've already started slaughtering the Israelis. And I said something about how it was morally disgusting. Suicide bombing was morally disgusting. And the nicest guy in the dialogue group, on the other side, said, you're demonizing my people. And I said, I'm not demonizing your people are demonizing themselves. Every Jew in the group was furious with me.
Oh, brainwashed.
Well, and part of the reason is that as soon as you start speaking seriously, dialogue is over. Oh, wait, we had,
Okay, Professor Landes, thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to to extract a point out of your talk, which you made in the very beginning, when you said that the strategy of the Cogwar resembles, the only thing that it resembles in recent history is the Soviet strategy, which I think is a very well-made point. And I would like to come back to it in order to, hopefully clarify something. In the KGB schools, high schools of KGB, that operated in the 70s and the 80s, they had a subject called, a discipline called Cogwar, where the theoretical foundation of how to do it was derived from Chinese wisdom, Chinese martial arts. The core principle is that if you're weak, or think you're weak, and you have a very strong enemy, engaging in a direct way with this enemy is completely pointless. You have to find in an enemy a weak point. In a physical way, you can basically imagine it as a struggle between a weak and a strong man, when you have to capture a moment where your enemy is not engaging with you. You pull him, for example, by the arm, and make his own weight work against him. You crash him into the wall. You don't engage directly. This was the principle of how you do the Cogwar. You approach a society, for example, American or Western society, and one thing that you do before you do anything else is finding the weak points of that society and latching on them.
Right.
In this case, it could be groups within the society that are already, they're pre-existing. You don't create them, you just identify them.
Right.
They are unhappy for their own reasons.
Right.
You don't ask why they're unhappy. Maybe they're unhappy because they don't have as many rights
Right.
as they would.
Right.
And he lists the groups,
Right.
the manual lists the groups.
Right.
You go to these groups and work with them
Right.
because they destroy society for you for their own
Yes.
reasons.
Yes.
In judging the success of the Cog War today, of I'd say Palestinian Cog War,
Right.
we need to ask ourselves, what are the groups they're latching on now, and what are their reasons to be unhappy? That is the key issue now.
Okay, so
Anybody got any answers to that?
We all have.
I'd just like to say one thing. One of the things that struck me about Caliphater Cogwar and its success is that it has had enormous success because the Western weakness is their attitude towards the Jews. And by attacking the Jews, by making an alliance with the quote-unquote progressive left against Zionism, the Caliphators have managed to get Western radicals to sign on to their apocalyptic scenario in which Zionism is the Antichrist, or what they call the Dajjal. Okay? And in secular terms, Israel is the Nazis. I mean, that, you know, the Nazis are the quintessence of evil for non-religious people. And so, as a result, also for religious people, but okay. So, the soft underbelly, that weak point in the West, has been to attack the Jews. And in France, not only did they attack Israel, but the Muslims attacked the Jews. And for 2 years, from 2000 to 2002, the French were in total denial that Jews were being attacked. And it wouldn't even get reported. And ultimately, what we end up with, and then those techniques of fake news pass from the coverage of the Arab-Israeli conflict to basically the coverage of the Caliphater Western conflict. So you end up, there's a term there's a medical term, there was a House episode about this, CIPA, chronic insensitivity to pain. And what happens with CIPA is that the nerves don't bring messages to the brain of pain. So you can literally burn your hand and not feel it, right? Our news agencies are the messages that get to the public sphere, and they are systematically filtering out the pain, and certainly the origins of the pain.
Yes. On that point, I'm glad you said that, because you said a few moments ago that the British media or Britain is weak against
Right.
anti-Semitism.
Yeah, right.
Today, some of my friends have read my Facebook column today, I got BBC World Service to apologise in writing on Twitter in response to the post that I responded to them, where they said BBC World Service for the last 3 days or several days have been trailing on BBC Sound app, on their website and on Twitter a trail for a programme which said Yiddish depleted in the 20th century. And I said, I'm very sorry, it wasn't depleted, it was a mass murder of Jews. And my grandfather, who was one of those people who was mass murdered, as was Nitzer's, the reason he's not speaking Yiddish for the last 50 years is because the Nazis murdered him. The BBC, it was a sorry, not sorry reply.
Yeah.
And the Jewish News is going to write a piece on Wednesday or Thursday. I would like to see the Times or the Sunday Times. I actually said to Richard Ferrer, who runs the Jewish News, I said, if I was still running my PR agency, I don't, because I don't have the energy to do it. You could place a story in any national newspaper if the editor had half a brain to read that Twitter, and they probably won't do it.
Yeah. Incidentally, there was a great line from the FBI after Waco, which I think summarizes how the BBC apologizes, which is, we didn't do anything wrong and we won't do it again.
The point is, it's institutionalized.
Right.
Can I just bring us back to the actual reason why your talk is here? We discovered that the Palestinian mission and Hussam Zomlot and Dr. Anne's Reed, which usually are putting their events in secondary schools. They went into, or tried to go into, the Chinkford County Girls' School. They went into, and this is from Hussam Domlot, literally tweeted the school on Twitter account and said, could I come into your school and bring information about Palestinians? And they said yes, and they didn't do any background checks.
Yeah,
Who's
no
the other
background.
two schools?
Okay, so for those who don't know, Hussam Zomlot is the so-called ambassador to the Palestinian mission here in London. He used to be the ambassador in America to the Palestinian mission, and he and his entire family had their visas revoked by, thank goodness, President Trump, and he closed down the Palestine mission there. Now, this Palestine mission seems to have a plan to go into schools. They've been to Wales, they've been to the trade unions in Wales
They've
to
been on
unite.
camps,
They've
holiday
been holiday camps, they've invited the Bewdley School into the Palestine mission in London. And what you see is what you saw on the Facebook page. You see the pictures of the children with the Palestinian, I hate using the word Palestinian, but with the scarf that they use. Yeah? So this is really why this is important, because we firstly, Zomlot was part of the Fatah organization that killed the Israeli athletes. I mean, this is not a nice time. So there are a few missions that we want from you people here, is to help us firstly to get him have his visa revoked. I think this is a very important thing we have to do, and the letter there is to the Home Secretary, and the more people who write in to their MPs and demand that he has his visa revoked. If you need information, you can ask us, we can send you his whole background, there are links there on the letter. So everything carry on from there.
Yeah. So without doing any background, this really does define your children, your grandchildren. I've got a 10-year-old. My daughter would be in a possible secondary secular school, not Jewish, but a secular school. If you know anybody who is in a secular secondary school, friends, colleagues, work colleagues, please ask them if anybody from the Palestinian mission or who has a Palestinian agenda will come into their schools. We need to know about it. We have contacted Ofsted. They didn't even do a background check on him. A man will come through a door and they haven't even done background
Or
checks on
social
who this
media,
man
or
is.
social media, not even a man they knew about. He contacted them by Twitter messaging. Yeah.
Yes.
Just talking about what you just actually said. Yeah, I went to I think it was a pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel meeting rather, and they were talking about...
The difference is anti-Israel is what they really are, pro-Palestinian is a facade. They couldn't care less about it.
They were talking about the whole infiltration that's been going on in the 80s. They sort of, I think probably earlier, worked out a way of infiltrating universities by getting Palestinian students to come on scholarships to universities, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we are now reaping the rewards of that now. And they're trying to do that in the schools.
Can I just
David, sure.
Because this is how coordinated this is what is really shocking. I did a BDS, I went to this BDS training camp where you're taught how to be a BDS activist. And the first thing they tell you...
Did you pass?
They make you in.
This was before you became famous.
I don't think I'd get in now. Point number one, they say the first thing you have to do is lobby your university to open a scholarship program so that they bring students from Gaza, always from Gaza, on scholarship. It embeds, this is what they're told, it embeds Palestinianism within the university, because that student will be there for 3 or 4 years. When he leaves, another one will come to replace him. Okay? I then started looking at the students, saying, okay, so let's have a look at the people who are coming. And I checked their Facebook pages. And you notice that about 6 months before they get here, their Facebook changes from Arabic to English, and they start pushing out regular anti-Israel propaganda. Then you realise that they're going to the Islamic University of Gaza, which is the main Hamas indoctrination centre, and they're attending courses telling them explicitly how to be anti-Israel activists, which means that this is Hamas's hand. Hamas is creating activists, and because they're coming here on scholarships, we're paying for their education. We're bringing them here, and they're doing what they're effectively doing is they're turning campus into an anti-Israel, hostile environment.
So what we have from that, which is important today, is that those youngsters have come along and into the schools, they've brought the Palestinianism, into universities, and the current generation of teachers, the young teachers, who are now 23, 24, 25, have come out of those universities, schooled in Palestinianism, and they are educating your children, or you're sending your children to a Jewish school to try and avoid it. But it's getting into our society now through the children. And for me, the saddest thing is that these children who grow up are not going to be aware that they've been indoctrinated. They're going to believe that's the truth. Just like I learned about Napoleon, and I trusted my teacher to teach me the right history. And this is what's coming into the schools now.
There was a gentleman, did you want to say
It's
something?
actually related directly to what you just said. On schools in the UK, there's a hidden threat, which is that local authorities and government have a say on what schools which receive state funding teach. And actually, the protest in Birmingham earlier this year that you talked about was over teaching LGBT matters in a state school, and there was parents protesting against that. So that is one element of it. But in general, there is a lot of secular bureaucratic involvement in faith school teaching, which is obviously something which causes concern amongst faith schools of all denominations. So obviously, some would want to act on that in an interfaith way, but I'm curious how you would describe an argument that both secures the right of faith schools, Jewish faith schools, to teach a curriculum which is not intruding upon, but also doesn't provide the safe cover for Muslim schools to indoctrinate and radicalise children.
Well, I mean, let me frame it in American terms, United States, which I'm more familiar with, and that is that, one of the principles in the Constitution forbids sedition. Teaching the Jewish faith does not, even if in its more fervent forms, does not call for the overthrow of the British government, quite the contrary. Whereas what's being taught by Caliphaters is literally the overthrow of the British government or of the United States government.
But then a lot of people in positions of relative power in local authorities and central government would laugh at that. They would say that was ridiculous experience.
I know. It's why I wrote the book on millennialism, because part of our problem is that we can't imagine this stuff. I mean, I remember in 1997, I had a meeting with Dan Pipes, and we went to high school together, went to college together, so we were all friends. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm working on radical Islam. I said, what's that? He said, well, it's people who literally want to see the Queen wear a burqa and the green flag of Islam fly from the White House. And I laughed. But at that time I was working on millennialism, and I realized that, just because they're wrong, they're not going to succeed, doesn't mean that they can't do enormous damage. I mean, the Nazis didn't succeed in founding a 1,000-jährige Reich, but they managed to do unbelievable damage on their way to failure. And part of our problem is our poverty of imagination. When the Oslo Accords in the 1990s it was clear very early on that they weren't going to work. And yet everybody was in denial, and part of the reason they were in denial is that, well, Palestinians aren't going to fight Israel. I mean, come on, Israel's much stronger. They'd never be that suicidal. And lo and behold, yes, they were. And somehow, with our cognitive egocentrism, we've managed to avoid facing that. So yes, they would laugh in my face. And that's why my book is entitled They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid.
I think most people, until it actually knocks on their door,
Yes.
even if it's next door, it's so far away.
Yeah.
Like, it wouldn't happen to me.
It's too late by then.
Literally.
Yes.
Thank you. Specifically relating to Israel, as we're all aware, there's been, since its inception, Israel's faced existential threats through war, and then when following
Jews, you exaggerated.
and then following the failure of 2, 3, 4 wars, we've seen an attempt to destroy it by undermining psychology psychologically through terrorism. But now, over the last 10, 15 years, far more insidious and far more detrimental and dangerous is this attempt to cause a schism within the diaspora.
Right.
And that seems to me that there is an absolute strategy afoot, and maybe funded by Soros, maybe funded by... I don't know where the money is being thrown in at, but it's specifically aimed at causing a schism within the Jewish community.
Right.
So we've seen in America, you've got J Street, you've got Jewish Voice for Peace.
If not now, yes.
If not now, New Israel Fund over here, we have Yachad, and within Labour. Effectively, what is our counter strategy? Are we now actually looking at, because we are a minority who see this, are we not now going to be involved in our own cog war?
Right.
Because we are the minority, we are the weak.
Yes.
And how do we
Yes.
counter
Okay.
it?
So there are two things. One is that this is a cog war, and that we have to fight, and our kids have to fight. I mean, you know, the idea which I grew up with, which was, you know, anti-Semitism is over. The job of a Jew is to be a productive member of society, to maintain our identity as Jews, but to be contributing members of the larger civil society and so on. And that if we do work hard in school and get good grades and work hard, we'll succeed, which is what has largely been the focus of Jews since World War II, is no longer enough. We are actually fighting a war for civilization, and it's not just for Jews, and it's not just for Israel, it's for democracy. And in that sense, we have allies. I mean, my motto is infidels of the world unite. Infidels and moderate Muslims who want the religious freedom to practice their religion and don't want these bullies taking over and telling them how they should be Muslims.
But their religion at the end of the day is Sharia. So
Exactly.
how do you say that you, at the end of the day, it's Quran, it's Sharia. They can't go against their religion.
No, really, it's the Quran, not the Sharia. Sharia
Yeah, it's
is
the
part
law.
of the Quran.
Yeah.
It's the
Yeah, it's the
Quran
law.
is separate to the Sharia.
It's their
So Sharia is in
interpretation.
the Quran.
No, it's where the other
It's a law.
where it's got,
What are you saying?
which is a problem.
There's, what, 200,000, 100,000, 150,000 Bedouins in Israel, who for the most part take exactly the same Quran and interpret it completely different. They look at the earlier passages, and the passage specifically where it says that before,
Earlier.
yeah,
But you can't then
Before
deny the
abrogation.
latter.
There's abrogation.
And the
and
latter
there's
outweighs
the
Right,
not
so,
Because there's a Jews as well, and yes, all down to interpretation.
Remember,
But
They're
specifically
controlled
we-
in Israel, they're controlled. Israel will not put up with any nonsense, they're controlled.
Okay.
Sorry, just leave it as
Michelle.
with the Bedouin, their imams.
Can we be diverting from our topic?
Yeah,
at the moment?
it's only a very brief.
Okay, all right.
I've only said one thing. Half, well, a tenth of what I wanted to say. They read a passage that says that before there will be whatever they call paradise on earth, before that comes about, the Jews will return to Israel. And
be destroyed.
No, that's an additional interpretation. That's an additional interpretation.
It says we'll go for the fake Mashiach and he'll destroy us.
No,
that's not in the Quran.
No.
No. In fact, the surah about the Jews coming back to Israel is one of the there are imams who interpret it as a charter for Zionism. The interpretation that they're all coming back so that we can destroy them, which Palestinian Media Watch has some terrifying clips, not just of imams preaching it and allegedly secular, Western-dressed members of Fatah repeating it, but a lady in the street saying, yes, the reason he's bringing them all back to Israel so we can exterminate them. That is not a Quranic. That's not explicit in the Quran, that's added on. It's like there's a principle in Islam called wala wa bara, which means to love the good and hate the evil. Now, the Caliphaters interpret it to love your fellow Muslim and to hate the infidels, right? And it's a fairly popular interpretation, but it's not the only interpretation. So, I think one of the things that we have failed to do is to encourage and identify seriously modern Muslims. We've systematically failed to distinguish, and this is Melanie's point in Londonistan, which is that we've failed to understand that just because a Muslim isn't explicitly violent doesn't make him moderate. And we take the Dawa Caliphaters as guides to the Muslim community, whereas in fact they're working hand in glove. And they do good cop, tough cop. And I think we need to develop that good tough cop routine, and I think it's important even to plan campaigns in which you act the tough cop and you line up people who will defend you when you get attacked. I mean, David, when you came out with your study, you probably should have prepared a brigade of people. I mean, you sent it out to some of us early. But it's not like we were sort of waiting for the counterattack, and we should have been, and ready to defend you. And I think it's terribly important for us to say, look, I know you're offended to Muslims or to members of our community who believe in dialogue and stuff. I know you're offended, but you have to understand where this person is coming from. I mean, Melanie Phillips' comment about how the Islamophobia is now used to make every criticism of Islam as taboo, as the utterly deranged principles that lie behind anti-Semitic paranoia about Jews wanting to take over the world, is a really good point. Now, it was phrased in language that was abrasive. And that's when The Guardian wrote their piece. They said, imagine if a Muslim had said this about Jews. Well, there ain't nobody in the Jewish community who rages genocidally about the Muslims the way Muslims rage genocidally about the Jews. It's not the same thing. And to say, oh, well, I mean, I've heard this 1,000 times. People say, look, we didn't like it when the Nazis accused us of wanting to take over the world, so we shouldn't accuse the Muslims of wanting to take over the world. And I say, we didn't want to take over the world, they do! You can't make those kinds of... They say it openly.
Enough of us take over the world.
Michelle wanted to say
I
something.
wanted to just add to going into schools, because I go into schools sometimes on behalf of Harid. And there's like for the sixth formers, and they show the Forgotten Refugees. You know the film? It's about all the Jews from the Arab countries, and it's always been really well received for the past 10 years, and shown it twice at SOAS and going into these Jewish groups. And then a few months ago I went to Haberdasher's boys' school, which is one of the best schools in the UK, And I was really shocked that one of the Jewish boys, they're sixth formers, found it Islamophobic.
Oh.
Yeah, so it was the first time it had happened. But that's the change, you see, with our youth, that it's dripping through and they're picking, whoops. Yeah. So it's really important that we're there to counteract and get into schools as soon as possible, because this is the Jewish kids, well-educated kids, they're picking up this sensitivity
right, and this charge of Islamophobia is basically, and this is I mean, we have to think this through. I don't have the answer to this, but I can point to the problem. If you depict Muslims behaving badly, the fear is that people will dislike Muslims. And therefore, any depiction of Muslims behaving badly becomes a form of Islamophobia, because it's going to lead people to be suspicious of Muslims, to be, and I honestly don't know what to say, although I would say that, you know, I've been pretty impressed by the degree to which Westerners have not gone into the kind of rabid hatred of Muslims, which certainly characterizes a lot of Muslim countries, about people who offend them. So, I mean, I don't know what to do, but I do know, I mean, there was an incident that happened at the beginning of the Intifada, 12 days after the Muhammad Abdullah story broke. There was a lynching in Jenin, or Ramallah. There was a lynching in Ramallah. And the next day, a PA-appointed preacher got up at the pulpit and called for the extermination of Jews. And he said, Labor Likud, they're all the same, they're all Jews. Kill them wherever you see them, have no mercy on them, and kill their friends like the Americans and so on, okay? The New York Times had William Orm, who was then the president of the Foreign Press Association, do a piece on, is incitement producing violence in the Intifada? The only piece of incitement that he cited was this speech. And what did he cite from it? Labor Likud, they're all Jews, they're all the same, ... close quote. And all the genocidal stuff was dropped. Now, I can say that, you know, if I had a student who was doing research on incitement and quoted something like this, I would fail them. But this is a major journalist, essentially from that point on, the silence on the genocidal quality of Palestinian discourse about Israel is staggering. You go to the Jew who called that Islamophobic, that kid, ask him, do you think that there's genocidal incitement against the Jews in the Palestinian public sphere? And I guarantee you he'll say no. And I guarantee you that if you said yes, he would call you an Islamophobe. So what do you do with a really terrible reality that you can't speak about?
I have a Palestinian friend, Arab friend, who is very well known. We know, if you were looking, we know who we're talking about. I asked him, studying in Jerusalem, where's the term Palestinian come from? He said, I've got no idea, I think the Israelis gave it to us. That was the first thing he said. Second thing he said, as an Arab, or Palestinian, Muslim, I feel safer living in Israel than in the disputed territories too. And three, when I asked Mike Freer, MP, who incidentally I voted for, the least worst option, would you be willing to meet this gentleman, Bassemi? He said, not only would he not meet him, but no Conservative member of Parliament would be willing to meet him because he's not in favour of a two-state solution.
Bassem is a one-state solution.
He's not a one-state solutionist.
He just doesn't think the two-state solution
But
can work.
look, I did that with Muda Zafran. I took him to Alistair Burt and asked him to meet him, and he declined. He absolutely, in public, declined to meet him.
And I was unemployed.
Completely. Wouldn't even countenance it.
I went to a King's College lecture, and there they have a Pew Research into immigration. all these liberal thinking academics came out with all how good immigration was. And I put my hand up and I said, well, don't you see the rise of abuse of women and anti-Semitism in this country? No, we don't study that.
Okay, so
Yes.
just a few more questions. Because I think
These two gentlemen.
Do you know, do you know of any courses in this country or America or Europe that do study jihadism out of interest? And or maybe if not, people that have done dissertations or theses
All right,
on,
so-
on jihadism.
Right,
And
okay.
have they had any consequences if they have?
Right, so,
And compare that to Israel, where probably there are more studies.
right.
Oh,
Okay, so what we're going to do with that is we're going to ask Richard to give us a little list of once
Yes,
you have
and
time to
you'll
think about
circulate it,
and we'll
right,
circulate
okay.
it to everybody. Roger wants a question there next to Richard.
I can tell you about the ignorance of Islam. Read the Quran.
Yeah.
Just read the Quran.
And they haven't.
Okay,
Winston Churchill.
At the back?
I'm changing now.
At the back then?
I've got a quick question. Something that I don't know in America is fine, but if you ask the average person in the UK, you know, where is Palestine? Or you say,
Right.
and you say, you know, who's a Palestinian? What is a Palestinian? Where is Palestine? The average person would say, I would think, which is my experience in my years, is it's where Israel is.
Yeah.
But then actually, you know, when you say to them, well, that was only the case, if you look at, say, 1917, it was originally an area that included Jordan and those areas. So Palestine's, when you talk about the West Bank giving back, you should also talk about the East Bank giving back. Why is that statement never made anywhere? Why is it something in the US that's ever come up?
Well, that statement was made. I don't know if you heard Lance Foreman in the EU Parliament give the most magnificent speech. If you haven't got it, contact us, I'll send it to you. He made the most incredible speech. I don't know if you heard it, Richard. I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you. It was fantastic.
Okay.
And he did it yesterday.
Excuse me. I just want to sum up at the end of what we've been talking about, how we can sort of sort this out, and why our leaders or leadership, particularly in the British Jewish leadership community, are not getting the message. It's something that my colleague, can I say my name on the film?
Yeah.
No, not you. Richard Millett sent me a screenshot this evening. Yes, you did, therefore. You sent me a picture. And this was at Limud.
Right.
Which is as you know what Limud is. Marie van der Zyl said, and I quote, heralds growing ties with Muslim communities, decries racist attitudes among some members of the Jewish community, and we need to stand together to defeat prejudice of all kinds. From that small quote, she is, again, attacking the Jews, or specific Jews within our community. I'm sure we can know who that is, for the angst against what is happening. It completely falls into what you're saying. We have a leadership who is more concerned about Islamophobia, the worry that the Muslim community may feel.
More concerned about Jewish Islamophobia than Muslim.
Anti-Semitism. And do you know, there's one other thing. There was a select committee about anti-Semitism or about racism, and I think it was in 2017, and the Board of Deputies made a submission of, I think it was a 2-page submission, entirely addressing Islam and who the government should deal with in this country, whether they should deal with men or tell mama. It had nothing to do with Jews and racism against Jews. The Board of Deputies submitted that. So that tells us.
Yeah.
One final thought, which is a bit depressing. In this country, the first wave of Muslim immigrants came chiefly in the 50s and 60s, and they were very quiet and they got on with their life. Today, it's these peaceful Muslims, children and grandchildren, who have become the extremists. So when you say not all Muslims, The problem was hatched so long ago, and now we have a fledgling of an extremist society. So when you say not all Muslims, I know I sound like a racist. I'm really not. I just want to know, what is the solution to that? Do we stop all Muslim immigration? I mean, what is the solution?
Richard Gabriel.
I'd like Richard to have the last word.
Just one more thing. Richard Gabriel says the non-Islamist Muslims are irrelevant because they're not doing anything.
All right, they're not doing anything.
Richard wants to tie this together.
Yeah, I would like to tie it together and come back to this issue of Islamophobia. As I said, the most important dimension of the demands made on dhimmi is not to criticize Muslims. Because Muslims are, by and large, I won't say all of them, but most of them, are members of shame-honor cultures in which public criticism is not criticism, it's an attack on your manhood. And as a result, they are highly sensitive to criticism. Right now, if you criticize them, your own people will jump on you for criticizing them. Don't upset them, or as I put it, the prime directive of the 21st century is don't piss them off. We need to develop the techniques, and again, I come back to this nice cop, tough cop thing. We need to develop the techniques whereby we can be critical. We have to be critical carefully. I don't think we should throw out massive accusations, but we need to be able to be critical, and when we're critical, we need people to have our back, and we need to stop these assaults on us by people who think they're doing good by making sure nobody's critical. It's the weak spot of the Caliphaters. They are enormously sensitive to criticism, and that is something that we not only haven't we exploited it, we literally let their sensitivities push us around, so that, you know, it goes back to the Rushdie affair. You know, it's not like Khomeini read Rushdie's book before he condemned him. He didn't have a clue. And I have a chapter in my book on the Danish cartoon scandal. How many people here know that the three most outrageous cartoons were not the Danish cartoons, but created by the imams who wanted to arouse outrage in the Muslim world? How many people know that? Okay? One cartoon, Muhammad being buggered by a dog. Another cartoon, Muhammad is a pig. And I forget what the third one was, but really disgusting. And the imams who were yelling at us for blaspheming their religion were blaspheming their religion, and we didn't have the good sense to say, how dare you do this? How dare you blaspheme your own religion and then accuse us? We have a right to defend ourselves, and we should be defending ourselves.
Yeah.